Put on the suit. That's fancy.
Yeah, that's very fancy.
No, that's about it.
I had
Hard to
some
be
tea this
fancy when you
morning.
have a toddler.
Yeah.
Put on the suit.
Hello, everyone. Let us know in the chat where you're joining from. We'll get started in just a moment. New Hampshire, nice. I'm in Maine, so not too far away. South Carolina. Bill, welcome. Headed to South Carolina next month, actually, for a little trip. Going to Hilton Head Island. It's my first time there.
Oh, that's nice.
Have either of you been?
Yeah, I've been there. It's great.
Nice.
I'm jealous.
Yeah, it should be good. We're doing Savannah, Georgia for a few nights before that. So getting a little good Southern food and then chilling on the beach for a while.
Savannah's nice.
Yeah, I've never been, so I'm excited. I mean, I'm into good food, and so is my husband, so we're pumped.
Yeah.
All right, let's get started. Can everyone see my screen?
We can.
Awesome.
Yes.
All right, I'll stop the music for now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Finer Tuning Club. Proper SIM tuning leads to better security outcomes. My name is Erica Mixon. I'm content manager here at Blumira. I'll be your host of today's very fancy webinar. As I've said, I've got my glass of fake champagne here. Cheers to everyone. Cheers. We're going to have a very fine time today. We're going to be talking about fine tuning of your SIM. And this is kind of in honor of The Office. I don't know how many of you in this webinar are Office fans, but there was an episode, or maybe a couple episodes, where there was the Finer Things Club. And the Finer Things Club would meet to discuss books and wear berets and talk about very classy things. So this is the Finer Tuning Club. We'll be talking about fine tuning, and we'll have a little bit of a fancy spin on it as well. And we're excited to have our very fancy guests. So this is Justin Kakani. He is a technical account manager at Blumira. Justin, am I pronouncing your last name correctly, by the way? I apologize if I'm not.
Perfectly.
I did good?
Yep.
All right, perfect. And Justin is a first-time webinar guest here at Blumira. So not new to, fairly new to Blumira, but not super new, but we're excited to have him on as a guest and have him share his expertise. Thanks so much for joining us, Justin.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about what a technical account manager does at Blumira.
Yeah, so I assist with getting new customers onboarded and ongoing support with existing customers, helping them make sure that everything is running smoothly and make sure that they're aware of all the new things we got coming.
Awesome. So you have a lot of hands-on experience with helping people to fine-tune their alerts and get their SIM up and running. So we're excited to talk to you about that. And we've also got Matt Warner, who's the CTO and co-founder here at Blumira. If you've attended a Blumira webinar, it is likely that you have heard Matt speak on various occasions. And as always, Matt, we're excited to have you on board today.
Excited to be here. Excited to have a headshot that looks like me currently. So that's exciting.
Yeah, it looks great. And you look great in your suit. Look very fancy.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried to keep it as fancy for everyone as I could.
Yes. To those of you who are joining in from afar, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea or, I don't know, champagne. We won't tell your boss necessarily, and just join us for a
necessarily.
I mean,
I like the qualification.
I can't make any promises, but
Sure.
well, we're excited to have you both join us and talk about this subject. So join us and we'll get started. And if you have any questions for folks in the audience, you can feel free to either use the chat or the Q&A. We'll be saving questions up until the end. There will be a Q&A session, but we're excited to address any of those questions that come up. So let's delve into it. But first of all, a nice GIF from The Office showing Pam inviting Jim to be in the Finer Things Club. So I'm curious as to how many people are Office fans in this audience here. So feel free to drop in the chat if you have watched The Office on a regular basis, or if you're familiar with it at all, just so I know what sort of references to be dropping here. All right, the challenges of fine tuning. So fine tuning is, from what I've heard, one of the more labor intensive processes that you need to go through when onboarding a SIEM. It can take a very long time. Justin, I'm curious to hear your experiences about this, because I know that you're a technical account manager here at Blumira, but you've also worked with SIEMs hands-on in the past from previous roles. And I'm curious to get your feedback as to how the fine-tuning process was for those other SIEMs and what that was like.
Yeah. And for, the other SIEMs in my previous lives, when you start doing fine tuning, I find that it can be very labor intensive at the very beginning of your process. But as you start getting more comfortable with it, as you start developing more mature processes around it, the hope and idea is that labor requirement goes down over time.
Mm-hmm.
And typically that's what you want. You don't want to just get fatigued by working constantly to bring those detections in line with what your organization needs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So fine tuning, if it's not done properly, can result in, as you had mentioned, too many alerts, an outdated SIEM that isn't necessarily up to date on the latest threats, false positives. Have you experienced any of those issues when you were working with SIEMs in the past?
Oh yeah, and especially when you're a team of one, it can almost seem like an impossible task. So joining a community, attending these sort of webinars, that sort of thing can definitely help to bridge that knowledge gap and make you more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That emerging threats component, Matt, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this. At Blumira, our incident detection engineering team is constantly working to, correlate threat feeds and do the latest threat research to make sure that our SIEM is properly updated. Is that something that a lot of other vendors do in this space that you've seen?
There's been a lot of changes over the last, let's say, 10 years in the SIEM market, where it evolved from, we'll give you some detections, or we'll give you a large amount of detections that might be categorized and you can figure out what to do with them, to we'll give you nothing and you can start from the beginning. And as things have evolved in the industry, we're now starting to see more open source detections. More people are moving to Sigma, which is an open source kind of detection format. And the interesting part of that is that while, let's say, publicly available detections are becoming more available, that puts the onus on fine tuning to be even more heavy, generally speaking, for the organizations, because in those situations, even if you're at a product that provides you a lot of detections, which some of them do, or if you're at a product that wants you to just bring in open source detections like Sigma detections or YAR detections, depending on how you're handling that, you still have to determine how that impacts your organizations. How do organizations that generally see this kind of data tend to potentially trigger this kind of potential threat that's also being looked for? So the IDE team, as you very correctly point out, is doing a lot of that work around how do people in the SMB space especially look across this kind of detection. So we'll use the example of like Print Nightmare. There's a lot of different overlaps in who interacts with print drivers, how the print drivers get interacted with, what applications are handling those print drivers. They're just generally leveraging that kind of part of the OS, and the ability to be able to kind of see how it's leveraged across organizations of like types and be able to tune across that becomes really important. And it's really difficult as a singular organization to say, how do I know how this is going to look for me? And the only way to do that is to then execute it, look at it, tune it for your organization, and make sure it works for you. And the only way to do that is to kind of eat the thing to the right here, which is false positives, and saying, how does this work for me? Is this right for me? No, this isn't. I need to tune this again. So, and if you're to Justin's point, if you're a team of one, I think it's really hard to do to say like every time a new thing comes out, I need to run it, I need to see what the false positives are, I need to tune it, and it can be really difficult, and it's a difficult effort to do just because of the vastness of knowledge and application. There's a lot. Probably best way to put it.
Yeah, sounds like it. Let's talk about alert fatigue. Both of you had kind of alluded to the idea of too many alerts. I'd love to talk about the experience of that. As a team of one or two, a small team, how does one handle just getting a flood of alerts all the time? What does that do for your psyche?
It can definitely be demoralizing. And maybe that's not quite the right term, but when you just see a steady stream of alerts, it's kind of hard to pick and choose what to tackle first, especially if you don't have like a pre-built knowledge base or something to pull from. Community resources are great for figuring out what you should be prioritizing, but again, every organization is different, so it's hard to determine what's right for your specific organization. Frameworks and compliance frameworks in general just kind of help to give you a little bit of an idea of what you should be looking at first. And over time, the idea is that you'll hopefully not have so many alerts once you actually start getting in there and tuning those detections.
That's a good point. And from the business side, Matt, how does that affect an organization in terms of cost to the business, in terms of productivity, general like overall ROI?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations who haven't had a chance to kind of think about how they approach risk and how that risk impacts the alerts that they're reviewing and what's happening in their environment. It's easy to get to a point where it's basically impossible to do the calculation of, is there an ROI or what are my analysts doing? Because let's say you get 100 alerts a day and the average is 20 minutes per alert, you've basically taken up that person's entire day at that point. There's nothing else they're going to do other than look at alerts, and that's it. That's all they're going to do. And in those situations, generally speaking, there has to be a way for the security team or the IT person doing security in that organization to kind of strip back what they're looking at and saying, well, what is the risk for my environment? What do we care the most about? What do we need to care about? And alert fatigue in general, if you aren't able to kind of, we'll use kind of compliance terminology, if we're able to kind of like de-scope that risk, like if you're in PCI, you would try to de-scope and making your PCI environment smaller. The same thing for your environments. You have to kind of de-scope that risk down. Otherwise, from a business perspective, your risk is just an unknown blob and you're kind of just throwing effort at it and hoping that, well, at one point we hit this thing. But realistically, there are probably only 5 to 10 things that you need to care about within like 10 hours of seeing it. And a lot of other things can be queued up between then and when you have time available to review it, which is to say, like, if you change your ACLs and RDP is open from the internet, you should probably know about that. If someone is scanning you from the internet, just generally, it's not something you need to know about. And knowing how that risk works for your environment and what you care about and how your environment's structured helps kind of support that business need and makes it so you aren't burning out your people and you kind of know where it's going to go and you get that ROI. But getting ROI in security is one of the hardest things out there. It's so hard to say, like, I have value from this thing, because it's hard to know even how you use the thing and how you tune the thing. That's the best way to apply it inside of your environment.
Right. And we'll talk about the prioritization piece that you're referring to a little later on. I did launch a poll asking how many alerts you receive on a daily basis. Looks like a good amount. The majority of our folks that are tuning in now are receiving 10 to 50 alerts per day. Some are receiving 50 to 100 and 100 to 200. 10 to 50 seems like a somewhat manageable range and somewhat expected. Am I thinking in line here, or is that still a little too much for a small team to handle?
I think the way that I look at alerts, it'll depend on the classification of those alerts. If you're getting 10 to 50 priority 1 alerts and they aren't being categorized properly, or you are legitimately under attack, like, Yeah, it could be too much, but in a lot of situations that we see here at Blumira, 10 alerts in a day might be things like we saw 2 or 3 users that saved some password files to their machine, and we saw one user that reset their password too many times. We saw another user that pressed fraud on Duo, and a lot of it tends to be when you get into that like 10 to 50 range, it tends to be you have better visibility into what your users are doing. So you're getting that view into kind of user-based risk, which is a great thing because you can get ahead of stuff, but it can result in that slight increase. And to Justin's point, that's where having your own processes comes into play, where like as an organization, we'll use Blumira as an example. As an organization, I know that when I get this alert from Blumira about a passwords file existing, I'm going to work the workflow, which is going to say you need to talk to your users about having password files on their desktop. I'm going to remove that file, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. And that's a fairly straightforward process, but still one you have to run as it happens. And ideally, you can leverage that into hey, let's all talk together, employees, and talk about why you shouldn't save password files. And here's a password manager for you to use. So you see a net reduction over time as you kind of push forward is kind of the hope of both.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And if you're using Blumira, at least the prioritizations of alerts can be really helpful in that priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 alerts. And then also the ability to respond to those with those built-in playbooks can be a huge time saver as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. I'm curious, one person responded other to the how many cybersecurity alerts are you receiving? Curious if you could comment in the chat what that exactly means. But let's move on before we get to some tips and we can talk some office trivia here, have a little fun with it. So, which of the following books was not read in the Finer Things Club? And I'll put the fancy music back on. Office fans out here, this is kind of a tougher one, but maybe you'll get it.
I've only read some of these.
I haven't read, I don't think I've read any of these, and I was an English major, so that's probably not a good thing.
No, we won't tell anyone.
Well, now it's published for the world to see. I think I watched the movie for Memoirs of a Geisha. We'll give people a little bit more time to respond here. Do either of you know the answer to this? Matt, Justin?
I did not. I had to cheat.
What's that?
I had to cheat. I did not know.
Oh, you cheated. Okay.
I know. Cheater.
Okay, so the other cybersecurity alert answer was from an MSP, so that was across 30 companies. That makes sense.
That makes sense, yes. I hope you're in our MSP NFR program. I could probably look, but I'm looking right now.
All right. Let's end the poll here. Okay, so the answer to this was Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was never a book in the book club of the Finer Things Club. I think in this picture you see here, I think that was A Room with a View, if I'm not mistaken. They also read Memoirs of a Geisha and Angela's Ashes. So just a little fun trivia for you today. I can't see exactly who voted what, but I'll be able to see afterward and we'll give you a little congratulations. All right, let's move on to some tips.
All righty. So,
knowing your baseline, how does an organization exactly establish their baseline? I mean, there's a lot of, it really varies by organization as to what activity is normal, what's not. How can, Justin, do you mind talking about a little bit about how you can establish your baseline and going about that process?
Yeah. So in general terms, how you establish the baseline is first just start collecting everything and then start doing some trend analysis or, look at what's going on in the environment and just investigate as much as you can to determine what is abnormal and what is truly normal in that environment. It's definitely difficult and time consuming at the beginning, But once you start seeing the trends that are going on in your environment and what people are doing, and oftentimes, doing some sort of interdepartmental questionnaires or interviews can also help with that to find out how people are using applications, especially if you're coming into an environment that's not yours to begin with, not something that you personally built or had a hand in. And along with that, I would tell you to take a look at what people and talk to as many people as you can that are working in similar verticals as the organization that you're in. So that way you can really see and utilize this sort of like crowdsourced knowledge base to find more about what your baseline could be or should be.
And those baselines, like I said, really vary from organization to organization. Matt, what are some of those differences in use cases?
The use cases are so incredibly varied, and one of the interesting parts tends to be, at least for me, is that you see use cases that probably, like, the way that I would look at them is, well, you're going to fatigue yourself if you move in this direction. We see a lot of, like, small banks and credit unions heavily logging things like account lockouts to the extent where they're going to work every single detection associated with account lockout. And when you think about that baseline, most organizations, like, you might want to know when there are a number of account lockouts. You might want to know when there's a pattern of account lockouts, but a singular account lockout is not necessarily something that most of us want to know in our baseline. However, as an organization, or as these organizations know, they're going to get audited. They're going to get asked these questions. They're going to have to prove that they're doing this work. And for them, they know their baseline includes looking at every account lockout, tracking every account lockout, and having proof that they worked every account lockout. And it's more of a good example of that last bullet point there, which is define what your business use case is as an organization. And the top of your organization, from an IT and information perspective, has to know kind of like what is supposed to be your baseline, what is supposed to be proper use, how are things supposed to look? Because to Justin's point, as an organization grows, and if you're moving into that organization fresh, it will have grown through shadow IT, it will have grown through its own internal processes, it will have grown through organizations and departments inside of your company doing what they feel works best for them, which is great. However, the moment you get into data collection, and the moment you get into kind of building out a security program, it really does mean that you have to define use case for your organization and build that baseline around it. So it varies really heavily. If you're a manufacturing company, you might care a lot more about where your OT network is and getting information out of that. If you're a hospital, you might care more about where that HIPAA and PHI data is being stored. If you're a PCI, you probably care a lot about where your PCI environment is and trying to make sure you're meeting your PCI requirements properly. And all of those fit into that baseline, which is always going to be different normal for every organization, because all of us, while we're using very similar technology, and one of the theories of Blumira is that you can apply detections to different baselines and still get the same outcome because the data is the same. But what that doesn't change is the baseline for your organization, what you want to see, how that data is working. And should you allow RDP from the internet? Should you allow plain text FTP? Do these things make sense for you? And how are your people leveraging their environments? And they're all really important. And to Justin's point, you kind of have to look at everything at once, or build up looking at everything at once. You don't have to literally look at everything at once. You kind of have to pull everything out to then review it and say, all right, here's where we are. Here's where we want to get to. Here's the plan to get to that point. We're going to kind of change that baseline as we move forward. Because it's okay if your baseline isn't where you want it to be when you start. That's expected. But you can change and grow that baseline over time. And that's really the big goal and hope in a lot of cases.
Right, that's a good point. And is it a good idea to kind of check in to see what that baseline is on a regular basis?
I'm sure Justin has some thoughts on timing as well, but I generally am a fan of anywhere from quarterly. If you can do a quarterly, otherwise biannually is okay as well. And usually the way that, like, I kind of look at it is, you should also think about doing things like tabletops. You should be talking about your environment. You should be kind of thinking in your head, like, where are we going? Where are we now? What if these things happened? And the baseline also fits into that conversation as well. So in a lot of compliance standards, it's going to require you to do it annually. However, it never hurts to do it more regularly if time is available to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
I know that time is, it's tough for IT folks to fit that into their day. So it's definitely a process. But Justin, do you have any tips for kind of making that process a little smoother and making it a little easier for IT folks to fit that into their schedule?
Yeah, I would definitely say proper documentation of everything, including, everything from your infrastructure to policies and procedures will definitely help you out in the long run. I know documentation is not necessarily my favorite thing in the world, as it probably isn't for a lot of folks out there, but that act of practicing good documentation habits, especially for when you're, onboarding any new tool or even offboarding devices, can save you a lot of time in the long run.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned, Justin, in our prep meeting was to get buy-in from the organization, including leadership. What is that process like, on the IT side?
Well, it can be different for every organization depending on who your leadership is. I was very fortunate enough to have direct contact with senior leadership, like C-level leadership. So for me, it was a very simple and easy process to explain to them what was going on, why we needed to have this in place. And once you do get that buy-in, you'll start to see like a trickle-down effect with middle management and even end users. I was very lucky that I had very honest end users. So shadow IT wasn't a huge concern for me, but it can be for other organizations and for other individuals out there. And that might change your baselines.
Yep, that's a good point. Matt, you had talked earlier about open source Sigma detections. What is the process of reviewing those and finding ones that could be useful to incorporate in your organization SIM?
Yeah, so there is a default Sigma repo out there. Sigma HQ has one with their kind of main rule set that they build out. If you're on a SIM, not on Blue Mira, because obviously we help you manage your detections, but if you're on a SIM not on Blue Mira, there are a number of sites out there that will convert Sigma over to whatever your SIM format is. So it can make it a lot easier for implementation. They're definitely worth reviewing in situations where you have either a niche that Sigma's likely covered that you want to try to cover, and really where they're really most useful is when you have new attacks coming down the pipe and you want to make sure you get initial coverage for it. And that can range from a ransomware playbook has been exposed, like when Conti ransomware's playbook was leaked a few months ago. That created a whole bunch of new detections for us here at Blue Mira, of course, but also in Sigma in general, where you're looking for more things like how is NS lookup being used specifically? How is who am I being used specifically inside of Windows? And I think a lot of organizations who see those in Sigma or broadly might think, you know what, this is going to be really loud. But in our experience, it's worth trying those kind of visibility for detections in your environment because they probably won't be as loud as you think they will. Because how often do we really run an NS lookup regularly? Like I run it sometimes, but I don't run it daily. And realistically, you want to know when those kind of things are happening in your environment. So they're very much worth looking at for I have a weird detection I know I need to do. Let's say I want to make sure I can detect proxy shell being dropped on an Exchange server associated with my IIS. That's a really specific type of detection. And if you don't have knowledge around how IIS works and how Exchange works, Sigma makes it really easy to kind of dig through, find that type of detection and load it into your SIM. But back to kind of the whole point of this topic, you will have to tune it because it's that overall, like we know this will detect that. However, for your organization, it will also detect XYZ. So you have to kind of use them as a jumping off point. And really the same goes for threat feeds. Blue Mira is a threat feed aggregator. We provide our own threat feed blocks. We also do our own threat feed generation. However, threat feeds and in general are transient. The IPs that are on them are transient. The content that's on them is transient. once a threat feed has been published and attack has started, it will not continue forever. That IP will not be bad forever, for example. So it's really important to kind of use those Sigma rules and threat feeds really both as this like, what's recent, what's working, is it going to work for me, is it getting what I want, or am I just detecting like an AWS IP which is now owned by someone else, and is that not really getting me the benefit? So kind of back to the whole concept of Blue Mirror at the very least is Sigma rules that are focused on behavior, 100% worth trying out in your SIEM. That's how we approach detection here as well. Blue Mirror, it has to be behavioral and it should be actionable. It allows you to really get tight detections, but more than likely that overlap of behaviors is that you still got to be that tuning. You still got to be adaptable in how that works for you and how it works for your environment.
That's great, Matt. Thank you so much. Yeah, being adaptable, definitely an important tip when fine-tuning your SIEM. And here we have a GIF of the always fancy Moira Rose from Schitt's Creek. Are either of you Schitt's Creek fans on Netflix?
I've seen a few.
Yeah, it's a good one. She's a fancy icon. So there are a lot of fancy icons in the GIFs of these slides. So hopefully you can recognize them and follow along here. And we're going to have a little bit more fun with you guys on this next slide with some more office trivia. Let me play some fancy music. This is a good thinking music. And launch the question, who was not a member of the Finer Things Club? Either of you know this one without cheating?
Want to say Andy?
Okay, I'm not giving anything away.
My initial guess would be Toby, but
Toby's
I don't think it is Toby.
He's always the dud.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
No one likes Toby.
Exactly.
I would have said Oscar, but he's in that picture.
Well, now you just gave it away, Justin. Way to
go. Context clues.
If you're an Office fan, you probably know that already, though. I like the intensity of this song. I don't know if people can hear it very well because there's always some
you can hear it.
Oh, you can?
Oh yeah. It's like being screamed at by a violin.
Oh geez.
I mean, I'm fine with that, but
No, we'll give you guys a little break from the music, and we've given you 1 minute to do this, so I think that's good enough. All right, so we have actually the majority of people who participated got it right. Andy was not a member of the Finer Things Club on The Office. He desperately wanted to join, but no one wanted to invite him in. Toby was one of the founding members, surprisingly. Same with Pam and Oscar. So congratulations to the folks who chose Andy. Good job. All right, let's move on to some more fine-tuning tips. We've got another fancy TV/movie icon, Cher from Clueless, who says, "I'm not prude, I'm just highly selective," which brings us to our next tip of being selective in making sure you're ingesting the right log sources, because not all of those log sources are going to provide security value or be useful to your team. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about what that process is like?
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those areas that to an extent varies by organization, but the way that we or the way that I approach this, the release in my head, and the way that we approach this is, where can an attack happen? Where can you get visibility into that attack? And what's the best way to kind of grow into that visibility? However, keep also in mind that if you want to define your baseline, you're going to end up having to collect a lot of this stuff in general. But prioritization never hurt anything, especially if you're thinking about it from a security value and not just a business value as well. It's something that's always worth, just a real quick aside, it's something that's always worth thinking about with your SIEM as to what's the business value of the data, what can you get out of that data, how can you drive your business forward and get visibility into what's happening in your business, which is very possible to get out of your SIEM as well, just as much as pure security value. So they're both important, both useful, but we're going to talk about security value here specifically. So the area that I and we always tend to really push on are two big areas, which is going to be your IM, which is going to be your Active Directory, G Suite, Okta, M365, however you're approaching IAM, however you're approaching controlling your users, and however they're approaching authenticating into things, that is going to be your highest value environment. If you're still a Active Directory on-prem and on-prem Exchange organization, which you are fighting the good fight if that's where you still are, and I compliment you because that's hard work, then getting that visibility into your DCs and your read-only DCs and your Exchange servers and to your broad server stack becomes really, really important. And not just getting logs out of them, but getting sysmon logs, getting detailed logs out of them, deploying GPOs to those servers, making sure that you're seeing really everything you want to see. Whereas if you are in full 365 and 365 or Okta, it's really, for your sake, it's a little easier in getting that information out of those environments. You don't have as high of fidelity of information, of course, but you also don't have someone attacking your on-prem Exchange server. So that you get give and take when it comes to that. The next two, I tend to kind of put in line with each other because it depends on your organization, to be quite honest. Firewalls, as well as your server and critical endpoints. And really kind of for me, it goes toward how you have your network structured. Do you know how your network is structured? If you have a good structured network, which is to say there's segmentation, there's going to have to be routing across those segments. You're able to have that kind of differentiation between your networks. You're able to get really good visibility into behaviors. Firewalls are always a great place to start because they're usually pretty easy to get going, unless it's Cisco ASA or Firepower. And if it is, I apologize that you've had to deal with that. It's not fun to get those up and going. However, it allows you to get that visibility between hosts, which is always great. If you aren't sure what the structures of your network, or you're concerned about in broadcast, like in subnet traffic, and you want to get that deep visibility, servers and critical endpoints become really, really important for that organization. Because realistically, and I know Justin, the TAM team, and we talk about this often, if you're getting those Windows firewall logs, if you're getting detailed connection logs at the host, and you're a flat network, you don't have to worry as much about those firewall logs, and you're not going to see anything on the switch logs anyways, but you're going to get deep visibility into how those hosts are connecting to each other. And if someone is able to get into that broadcast, you'll be able to see if someone is port scanning from inside it, whereas you wouldn't be able to see that if you were lacking segmentation in that flat network. So really it is a kind of back to that baseline of like, what does your organization look like? Have you documented what your organization looks like? Are you sure? Because if you aren't sure, which is totally okay, because that is just the way IT and security goes, you really are better off starting with getting granular visibility into servers and critical endpoints, and then growing into firewalls. And then lastly, all of your cloud apps. Not all of them can give you visibility. Some of them can, some of them can't. You kind of have to think about how they're built and structured, which is to say, if you're an organization that's growing into M365 and you now are growing into Azure, and then you grew into Mimecast as well, you want to make sure you're getting those detailed Azure logs out just as much as those Mimecast logs out, just as much as those Exchange logs in your environment as well. And of course, then if you combine that with your endpoint and critical server logs, which may or may not be in Azure, you then have this kind of holistic view as to where an attack could take place across your entire environment. I'll let Justin go. I'm going to keep rambling, which would be bad for me.
No, those are great tips, Matt. Justin, I'd love to hear your experience of, you told us earlier that you had to log everything for some previous roles that you were at. What was that like? And, how did you overcome that?
Yeah. So a brief little background is the organization in question was breached prior to my joining that organization. So there was a lot of fear from the top down about the next attack, whatever that could look like. So a lot of what Matt was saying is actually stuff that I didn't practice without actually knowing, because I was relatively new to this a few years ago. I started at the firewall level, and then I took a look at the server and other critical infrastructure. But there were certain requirements that made us look closer at remote user endpoints, especially with the shift over to remote work being more important, and especially after the pandemic that blew everything out of the water. So we started very broad in scope, and what we realized is that we weren't really getting a lot of valuable data from some of those endpoints, and so we truly had to sit back and take a look at what is actually important. Are these remote endpoints actually important? And after a lot of analysis, we determined no. And that's perfectly fine in some environments. Your requirements may vary. And Matt made a lot of good points too about any sort of cloud services. When you're thinking about cloud apps, don't just think about infrastructure that you're deploying in the cloud. Think about all the other services. Using Azure as an example, NSG flow logs can be very interesting. It's very similar to almost firewall logs in a sense. And especially if you have distributed networks in Azure and you're not sure exactly how those are segmented, that could be a valuable point of logging. One thing that I would tell you, especially if you're not on Blumira and you're using other SIEM tools out there, is keep in mind how those pricing tiers can work over there. One thing we found was that if we started logging all these remote endpoints, our storage quotas would just get blown out of the water. So be selective, not just about the alerts that you want to get out of the tool, but also in what you're logging.
Yeah, those are great tips, Justin. Something that you said earlier to us was don't let fear be the driver of your decision making when it comes to fine tuning. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, thanks for that insight. That's all really great tips. Let's move on to our next tip for our attendees here. Customize to your needs. And this is one that we're particularly excited about today. As we'll get to a little later on, we have some exciting new features that enable Blumira customers to do this exactly and allow them to do it without by themselves in the app, which is really exciting from our perspective. But let's talk about what some particular needs might be where you have to customize detection rules to be aligned with that. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And Matt kind of alluded to some of these when we were talking about compliance frameworks earlier and de-scoping, especially when it comes to like PCI DSS. But, you know, in my experience, when it comes to, at least with HIPAA, you know, you might need to just log what is being accessed and not necessarily how you're being alerted to that. So you definitely want to take a look at the rules that you have, especially if you're getting those open source detections that Matt was talking about, and determine if this is something that you actually need to be alerted on, or whether you need to customize those detections that come out of the box to just be a report. And reports can be valuable. Executive summaries can speak a lot too when you're trying to look at getting value out of a tool like this. Like Matt said, it's notoriously difficult to get value out of, you know, a security tool, but it can definitely help if you have data to back up when you're presenting this to leadership, whether you're in a procurement phase or whether you're in like an ongoing evaluation phase. Compliance frameworks, not just compliance frameworks, but actual security frameworks like NIST can also help in customizing things to your needs. I can't stress this enough, but document. It can definitely help out when you're trying to determine, you know, the layout of your network and what is actually needed from there. And Matt alluded to that earlier, and I think he has probably a lot more that he can provide on that too.
Yeah, it's I'm gonna Jasonly answer a question we got as well. Up here, we got a question about non-critical systems. What if they're used to pivot? And how, wouldn't you want to kind of stop the attack before it gets to that point? And this relates to kind of customizing to your needs here as well. And kind of to the point of this question, if you have non-critical systems that have the potential to pivot into critical systems, then those are also the potential to be critical systems. And that kind of goes to customizing to your needs. If your network and your infrastructure is set up as such that let's say a non-critical remote system has the ability to VPN in, and then at that point would have the ability to access a read-only DC adjacently, which would then have the ability to then get over to a real DC or run DC sync, then you have that attack service that really has to be covered across those environments, which is to say, if you have a salesperson with a Chromebook and that Chromebook can do only one thing, which is log into G Suite and use, you know, the web portals and sheets, and they're able to make calls, that is a much more confined non-critical system. However, here at Blumira, and if you've watched other webinars with us, you've probably heard me say this before, we want you to send us literally everything if you can. And it is for that exact reason of that question of, it's really hard to know what a non-critical system is. I only say start with critical systems because it's much easier to know what you can look at and be like, I know that that is a critical system. But that's really more of a starting point and somewhere you have to grow out to. And that kind of goes to this first bullet point here. Where do you have your unique risks? How have you built your organization that allows that connectivity in? Can your users not even VPN anymore? Can they just go to M365 and use Intune to control the entire environment? If so, you might have reduced that risk. You might be able to change how you're getting visibility into those hosts, which is great. But in some situations, and a lot of situations with Lumira customers, you're going to want that remote log. You're going to pull it in. You're going to pull it over the VPN. Maybe you're going to pull it over TLS syslog. Maybe we'll have better ways to do that in the future. I don't know. Watch other webinars. But there are a number of areas that it's really important to think about how it's working, because you might have 90% of your workforce on kind of basically disconnected remote work machines that really can't get in, and you're monitoring the IAM. So you can have visibility into how they're being touched, but you might have a small 10 to 15% that really has direct connection. And if they got popped, that machine could be leveraged to then get into an internal network. So it really varies depending on who your users are, how they're leveraging that environment, how it's structured, and also kind of how you're leveraging cloud services these days, because that is the benefit of modern cloud services, ignoring how much they cost and how much of a pain in the ass they are, and the fact they go down all the damn time and they're exhausting to deal with. Ignoring all those problems, it is great that we can basically hand off some of that risk and say, all right, Microsoft 365, you're going to eat this risk for making sure that we can get this up and going, that we can monitor this user's access, and we monitor who else is touching this user's account. And it allows it just to be easier. And to continue that point, it also depends on what you're doing. If you're using an RMM that's running executions that look similar to a ransomware playbook, you're going to have to customize it to your needs. It's the inevitability of it all. We see it all the time from ConnectWise Lab Tech. It is just something that happens. And an attacker is going to approach an attack the exact same way in a lot of cases an RMM will. So it requires people to kind of think about, well, how am I approaching this? Do I need to sign this PowerShell? Do I need to approach this a little differently? No, I think it's okay. I just need to make sure that I'm allow listing this specific part or filtering out this connection that's coming from LabTech to PowerShell. But when you do that, you have to think about, well, I've now created an opening on LabTech ConnectWise and saying, well, what if someone gets in there? What if someone's able to authenticate into there? So I need to make sure that that critical server is protected. Let's say if you're using on-prem in that situation. So it's kind of that, going back to what Justin and I were talking about earlier, back to that like tabletop documentation, walking through your environment just in your heads. It doesn't have to be a deeply formal thing, but just what is our compliance needs? Are we following a security framework? Are we following a hard and fast compliance framework like PCI, or we'll go with PCI or HIPAA or GDPR if you're one of the people who has that pain. And how are we applying that across our use cases in our environment? And best case, how can we then look forward and say, how can we de-risk? How can we keep pulling risk out of our environment and move so we don't need to look at as many logs? We can look at these logs that will have most of the information that we need within that environment. And lastly, I'll mention deploying honey tokens and honeypots will always make your life easier, just across the board. Usually they're going to be quiet like 99% of the time, which is great. And if they aren't quiet, it's usually because your vuln scanner is hitting it, which in some cases is nice because then you have proof that your vuln scanner is doing something. In other cases, is annoying. You're like, please stop telling me about this. So we have our own honeypot here at Blumira that we recommend using. If you use our sensors, you can use as many as you want. But more adjacently, we have a repo that we can put a link up for. I think we put it in here. Yes, for curb roasting detection like AS rep roasting. We have some blog posts about this as well. Feel free to use this for your own environments. And essentially what this does is it forces any attack in your environment that was going to run Kerber roasting to go through this honey token. So you're always able to get visibility on when there are attacks across your environment. And that kind of goes back to customizing to your needs. And to Justin's point, if you know that organizations or your organization has these users that will never be logged into or never touched, or these things will never happen, you can set those up as honeypots in your environment or honey users in your environment. and build reports around them and say, hey, did we have any access on this user over the last day? Do we have any oddities that we're seeing across this environment? And it allows you to kind of take that action across your environment without having to worry about, like, I'm creating a whole bunch of new alerts for me as you grow into those changes.
Well, thank you, Matt. That is a lot of really great insight there. So we appreciate that. And yeah, check out this blog post. I just dropped it in the chat on how to detect ASREP roasting. It's definitely one of the more niche detections that I've seen that it seems like a lot of other SIMs aren't able to do that. And something that a lot of pen testers will do as well is look for ASREP roasting. And it's really cool that we have the ability to detect that there. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about detection filters. This is our new feature that we just announced yesterday. Matt, I'd love to hear, once you've taken a sip of your blood orange San Pellegrino,
Yeah,
I'd love
I'm
to
very
hear
happy.
an explanation on what detection filters is. You explained it to us so succinctly in our
Oh
previous
yeah, I was supposed to remember
meeting.
how I explained this. I'm gonna try to do that right now on the fly. Blue Mirror, yes, this week, beginning of this week, last week, released the new last week. Thank you.
Yeah.
Time is relative to me. We'll release our new detection filters, and one of the hardest parts about tuning in SIM in general is that you rarely get the ability to do contextual tuning, and more importantly, usually tuning is just not easy. Usually you have to write some amount of code, either the query language of that specific SIM, SQL, whatever it happens to be, and you kind of just have to hook it into the existing detection and kind of just hope that you did it properly. And what the new detection filters do that Blumira has released over the last week is it allows you to have contextual visibility to that finding and be able to easily build the detection filters based off the available evidence within that detection. So if you have severity name, if you have specific users, if you have specific email, it's just a simple process to say, I don't want to know about this when the severity name equals this, or I don't want to know about when this user logs in from this country because I already know they live there. I want to know when other people do, but this specific user doesn't matter to me. And it allows you to have really powerful control over Blumira, over your detections, and be able to quickly move through them and use Blumira in a way that kind of going back to the slide we just left, you can customize it to your needs on top of the work that the IDE team is already doing to really reduce as much down as possible. Because we all, in general, have our own unique use cases. It is inevitable we grow our own unique use cases as we grow our organizations and our IT infrastructure. And detection filters let you take that unique use case and quickly and easily apply it to the detections. So you don't need to worry about how I learn a new language or how I make this work for my environment. It's just a straightforward, here's a thing, I don't want to know about that thing, or things, pair of things, multitude of things together. And it allows you to get the visibility you really want out of the product as well. Justin had anything he wants to know?
No, I don't think I could top that explanation, but there have been some very common customer interactions that I've had to kind of highlight just the ease of use with this. So, when you're working through one of our workflows, if you determine something is a false positive, like let's say you got a vulnerability scanner, like Matt was saying earlier, that keeps hitting the same IPs and it keeps triggering the same detections, you can now exclude that. And that will reduce that alert fatigue that's coming along with that. If you have an RMM that's pushing out scripts for your own management, like, doing just standard Windows updates or some, invoking web shells or something like that, you can exclude those if those are expected actions in your environment. And it's super easy. I don't know how many of you have used other SIMs out there, but I can speak to at least Elastic, and I can tell you that this is a lot easier than trying to work through those.
For sure.
It's no fun learning KQL or YAML or JSON just to get a detection filtered out.
Thanks for that, Justin. So detection filters is available for all of our advanced edition customers, but we do have a free edition that you can check out at no cost to you, no credit card required, no sales conversation required. So sign up at blumira.com/free and you can dig into the product yourself and see what that experience is. With the advanced edition, you do get access to technical account managers such as Justin, who will help you with the onboarding process, answer any questions, and really be a great resource when it comes to basically an extension of your security team, helping small teams really, make the best of what they have and extend their resources that are already existing within their environment. So feel free to check our free edition out at bluemirror.com/free. And please sign up for our demo on detection filters if you want to learn more about that. That's September 22nd at 1 p.m. I'll drop the link here in the chat. But yeah, we're almost coming to the end of the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for stopping by and giving a little bit of your time to learn about SIEM fine tuning and join us on this fun webinar today. Hope you had a little bit of fun and hope you learned a lot. And Justin and Matt, thank you so much for joining us and giving your expertise and for bringing your fancy attitudes and your and your fancy drinks.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. And thanks again for joining us. Join us on our next webinar, which is, again, that demo. And we'll follow up with you via email for a link to that. So thanks so much.